Podcasts are the new media, and it showed how it worked in this US elections. So, if we talk about podcasts, for the last 15 years, podcast was already in the space, and people were taking it not so serious because so many influencers that hopped on and made it like comedic podcast or a gossip podcast. But this time, podcasts have changed the narrative of the whole elections, and we're gonna talk about it. In these elections, if you actually notice, Donald Trump and Kamala Harris have been the part of multiple podcasts, having a lot of people watching them and understanding their perception in a longer form content than the shorter footage legacy medias showed in a different perspective to shape the narrative. But this time, in most of these podcasts, since they were long form content that allowed them to show their personal ability, show their personal brand, show what they're believing in, show how they're relevant or how they can provide a betterment for the country. So if you're somebody who actually thinking about starting a podcast, or if you're on the fence of starting a podcast, you should start consider one now. You never know what happens later down the road. So let's talk about the stats. The total number of podcasts where Donald Trump was being the part of was 14 podcasts compared to Kamala Harris. She's a part of 5 podcasts with this election campaign. And that total number of podcasts, which was 14, generated over 130 million views. 130 million people actually saw Donald Trump on these podcasts, and with 5 podcasts, the total YouTube views for Kamala Harris was 4 million. And now we're going to talk about the podcast that had Donald Trump on, and also for Kamala. Donald Trump was on Logan Paul's Impulsive, All In Podcast, Aiden Ross's Stream, Lex Friedman, Dr. Phil, Dave Ramsey Show, Ben Shapiro, Andrew Schultz. These guys, most people don't take them serious, but now since they had the podcast that allowed them to have the former president of the United States to get on their show, and millions of people were actually watching it. Full Send with the Neck Boys, Busting with the Boys, Patrick Bet David Show, 6 Feet Under with Mark Calloway, formerly known as The Undertaker, Joe Rogan Experience, which was the most viewed episode out of all podcasts I'm stating right now, over 50 million views, which was insane. Theo Vaughn Show, Bryson DeChambeau, Golf Video. For Kamala Harris, she was on 5 podcasts which generated only 4 million views, and out of those podcasts were Call Her Daddy by Alex Cooper, All the Smoke by Matt Burns and Stephen Jackson, The Breakfast Club by Shel Megan, The Checkup with Dr. Mike, and Club Shay Shay with Shannon Sharp. So which was pretty clear and evident this time that the narrative had not been created by the legacy media. This time the narrative had been created by podcast media. Been on a lot of podcasts actually resulted in a lot of people change their mind, belief, deciding who to vote, who to not, and that decision of those votes was in front of you. Think about a couple of years back, people were not taking podcasts serious at all. But now this time, podcasts have changed completely the narrative. Podcasts can actually change the perception of the people. So if you're still somebody who is actually thinking about starting a podcast, I have some free challenges. The link is in the description down below. Just go check there, learn how to start your podcast in the next 5 days. If you're gonna have any questions, comment down below and let me know what your thoughts are about this in particular, of like how you think like podcasts have changed the narrative this time for these elections. I'll see you guys in the next video.